Welcome to the Reality Revolution. I'm your host, Brian Scott. And today I'm excited we're going to talk about U.S. Andersen, one of the great post-New Thought authors who wrote some terrific books. One in particular, 3 Magic Words, is my favorite. And we haven't done any material by U.S. Andersen, so I'm genuinely excited to cover a chapter. We're going to be reading a chapter called The Hidden Cause of All Things in his book Magic in Your Mind. And if you haven't read any U.S. Andersen, he is fantastic. Really talks about imagination and loves to quote William Blake. I see a lot of Neville Goddard in U.S. Andersen without as much of the biblical references. Just for some background, U.L. Stanley Andersen, or U.S. Andersen, was born in Portland and was actually a football player. Played for the Rams and the Detroit Lions in the 40s and had a bunch of careers. Ran an advertising agency, wildcatted for oil, was a logger at the Columbia sawmill, and in the 50s moved to Los Angeles and became a successful businessman. And as a young man, Andersen began studying the concepts of Christian Science described in Mary Baker Eddy's book, Science and Health. He later began to study New Thought, in particular, The Science of Mind by Ernest Holmes. Holmes was a contemporary of Andersen, also living in Los Angeles at the same time. It really isn't known whether or not Andersen and Holmes knew each other. People suspect they did, just because they were in the same city, talking about the same stuff. And in 1952, Andersen began teaching a class on New Thought. The lessons from that class became his book, 3 Magic Words, which has subsequently become a classic in the New Thought literature. The book has been linked to the New Age philosophical concept as the law of attraction. He also wrote about non-spiritual subjects with some success. And he taught that New Thought concept of universal mind. According to Andersen, the universal mind is a vast and all-encompassing mental and spiritual being in whom all things and events exist. According to Andersen, the universal mind, or God, manifests or literally reflects the dominant belief system of all living things. When one understands this cause and effect relationship, it becomes possible to consciously use universal mind to shape the physical world. In 3 Magic Words, Andersen makes the argument that the physical world is derived from the mental. He argues that a sustained mental image, if backed by faith, i.e. a belief that the image is real, or will become real, will become reality. This can be done by using a spiritual prototype, or mental equivalent of which one wants to manifest in the physical world. The concept of a spiritual prototype originated in New Thought literature in the early 20th century. Specifically, Andersen said the following: all things and all circumstances must first be created on the mental plane. When such creation is clear-cut and born of faith and conviction, nothing can stop this image from becoming real. Once this image has come into your mind and you have accepted, you have done all that it is necessary for you to do. All the process of creation, time, place, and circumstance must be left in the hands of the all-knowing subconscious mind. The physical circumstance you desire may come from a direction you expect it, or it may come in such a way, in such a manner as you have never dreamed. Don't strain or urge or be impatient. Simply have faith and let go. You have nothing to do but create the mental image with complete faith. And with that simple act, the process is completely done. Be assured that the image will become real in your physical world, for you are dealing with law and law alone. In other words, his philosophy is similar to that in the New Testament, which teaches, as ye believe, so shall it be done unto you. More recently, this idea is reflected in The Secret by Rhonda Byrne and by Neville Goddard. Andersen argued that it was possible to prove his theory by conducting a few mental experiments, aided by means of meditation. After running these experiments with complete faith in the outcome, it is possible to demonstrate, at least on a subjective basis, that there is a relationship between thought and physical reality. Evil is the result of false thinking, is what he would propose, and the remainder of Andersen's theory followed from that simple premise. Since physical matter is created first on the mental plane, Andersen argued that good and evil events were also created by thought. This leads to a startling conclusion. If evil is created first on a mental plane by thought, then it becomes possible to abolish evil by refusing to believe in its existence. Andersen argued that evil was error and that mankind should simply refuse to accept its existence. Specifically, he wrote, "If we know that evil proceeds from thought, just as good proceeds from thought, we can establish eternal sentinel on our minds to guide our thoughts in the path of good and progress. Being illusion, evil dissipates with consummate ease." Andersen was not the first to argue that evil does not exist and is a creation of man's false belief about the world. That notion had been expressed by earlier New Thought writers, in particular Ernest Holmes, whom Andersen cites in his writing. As explained by Holmes, "The time must come when evil shall be rolled up like a scroll and numbered with the things which were once thought to be." Prior to Holmes, the Christian Science community argued that illness was a false belief which manifested in the patient's body. Change the belief and the patient gets a different result, i.e. health. Holmes and Andersen expanded on this idea by generalizing it to all evil, which they argued also did not exist and was a product of false beliefs. Probably my favorite line from Three Magic Words is when he talks about this fascinating theory of evolution. And I really love this, and it feels true to me. And we are thinking and creating, and so are all of the animals, even the insects. We're not aware of it, but we can see it. He argues that all living creatures share the same universal mind, an accompanying power to create with human beings. This leads to the observed effects of evolution as living creatures aspire for greater physical abilities to ensure their survivability. Andersen writes, "This mind or intelligence is not in man alone, but in every living thing. Behold the process of evolution, and you will see desire being projected into the universal mind and returning in physical reality. The fish experiences land and desires to walk and become a reptile. The reptile experiences air and desires to fly and become a bird. The reptile desires size and strength and becomes a horse. Bears, wolves, tigers, lions, snakes, everything that creeps and crawls and flies and swims and burrows and builds and desires, all are results of thought or desire projected into the universal creative mind of God." So imagine everything we see are the thoughts of even animals and the plants. Who knows? Andersen also argued that this power, often described as the law of attraction, can be directed at will by controlling the sustained believed images in our mind. Establishing sentinel over our thoughts is not as easy as it sounds. Andersen recognized that humans are constrained by existing beliefs about themselves and the world, fixed in their subconscious by past experience. He called this the lock because it made it difficult for a person to believe in the desired outcome. Andersen argued that it was possible to break the lock of negative past experiences by means of meditation and steadfastly creating mental images of the desired outcome. Sounds familiar? He recommended daily meditation in support of his thought experiments. Only hundreds of pages of discourse of proof will weaken its prejudice. So this chapter comes from a wonderful book, Magic in Your Mind, and we may dedicate several episodes to this book. Of course, we can cover 3 magic words, but this is a good place to start. The hidden cause of all things. There is a mental magic that assures success, that absolutely guarantees increased achievement, whether your profession is in the arts or business, in science or sales, in sports, war, or politics. Here you will learn the secret way in which your mind is tied to the source of all power. You will learn how you are capable of becoming anything and doing anything you can visualize. Every man's consciousness is constantly changing, is trapped at the knife-edge overlap of past and future, reacts rather than acts, is incomplete and partial, eternally seeks itself, for since the mere state of being throws no light on that state, consciousness learns of itself through reaction to outside stimuli. If a man comes to belief he is unsuccessful, it is because he carries the impression he has been unsuccessful, and this conclusion, once adopted, inescapably molds him into the shape of things he believes, locks him in a prison of his own making. The magic by which a man becomes free is imagination. By training himself to cast up mental pictures of the thing he desires, by resisting sensual stimuli, even envisaging the exact opposite, he tends to assume a factual position in accordance with his vision, for his vision then becomes his experience, rather than the sense stimuli that moved him before. Consciousness always assumes a form to suit its knowledge of itself, and where such knowledge breaks beyond limits imposed by sensory experience, man begins to grow into the image of the secret self. There is only one mind in all creation. That mind is in everyone, is in true state of being, not confined to anyone, not confined to the body. It is a central, knowing consciousness in which everything dwells, which dwells in everything. In a bodily confined state, it assumes the limitations imposed upon it by the knowledge of itself, which it receives through the senses. But when bondage to those senses is broken by development of an inner power to perceive and know directly, then slavery to its embodiment is at an end. Perfect action and perfect works stem from an inner conviction of the mental cause behind all things. A man changes the state of his outer world by first changing the state of his inner world. Everything that comes to him from outside is the result of his own consciousness. When he changes that consciousness, he alters his perception and thus the world he sees. By coming to a clear understanding of the process and effect of mental imagery, he is led irrevocably along the correct path to his goal. By working with this cause of all things, his own consciousness, he achieves infallibility in works, for inasmuch as his mental imagery propels him into action, that action is always true to the picture in his mind and will deliver him its material counterpart certainly. This is a program for training the image power of the mind, so that a scene or situation cast up in consciousness will arrive in 3 dimensions, with color and sound, pulsing with life, as real for you as the outside world. Haven't you dreamed such dreams? Haven't you sometimes in sleep become immersed in a mental and spiritual world with such solidity and dimension that you were certain it was real and the material world a delusion? If ever you have known the overwhelming power of mental imagery to influence your attitude and perception, then you will quickly see that the salvation of each of us is to train his image power to obey him. In this manner, it is possible to become free from the promptings and urgings of nature, from death and disease and destruction, from ineffectuality and frustration. For the man whose inner power of vision transcends the constantly distracting stimuli of the outer world has taken charge of his own life, is truly a master of his fate. I give you the end of a golden string. Only wind it into a ball. It will lead you in at heaven's gate, built in Jerusalem's wall. William Blake. Shakespeare's Hamlet, in his famed soliloquy, pondered to be or not to be, and thus squarely squared the primary challenge of life. Most people only exist, never truly are at all. They exist as predictable equations rather than acting, walking compendiums of aphorisms and taboos, reflexes and syndromes. Surely the gods must chuckle at the ironic spectacle of robots fancying themselves free. But still, when finally the embodied consciousness rises above the pain-pleasure principle of nature, then the true meaning of freedom is made apparent at last. Action versus reaction. We exist in order that we may become something more than we are, not through favorable circumstance or auspicious occurrence, but through an inner search for increased awareness. To be, to become, these are the commandments of evolving life, which is going somewhere, aspires to some unsealed heights, and the awakened soul answers the call, seeks, grows, expands. To do less is to sink into the reactive prison of the ego, with all its pain, suffering, limitation, decay, and death. The man who lives through reaction to the world about him is the victim of every change in his environment. Now happy, now sad, now victorious, now defeated. Affected but never affecting. He may live many years in this manner, wrapped with sensory perception and the ups and downs of his surface self. But one day pain so outweighs pleasure that he suddenly perceives his ego is illusory, a product of outside circumstances only. Then he either sinks into complete animal lethargy or, turning away from the senses, seeks inner awareness and self-mastery. Then he is on the road to really living, truly becoming. Then he begins to uncover his real potential. Then he discovers the miracle of his own consciousness, the magic in his mind. Mastery over life is not attained by dominion over material things, but by mental perception of their true cause and nature. The wise man does not attempt to bend the world to fit his way or to coerce events into a replica of his desires, but instead strives for a higher consciousness that enables him to perceive the secret cause behind all things. Thus, he finds a prominent place in events by his utter harmony with them. He actually appears to be molding them. He moves effortlessly through the most strenuous action, the most perilous times, because his attunement with the mental force that controls the universe guides him to perform the work that needs to be done. Electromagnetic mind. This mental force that controls the universe may be called anything you like and visualized any way you choose. The important thing is to understand that it exists, to know something about how it works, what your relationship to it is. It might, for instance, be likened to an enormous electromagnetic field. All conscious forms of life then would be tiny electromagnetic fields within the universal field and finding positions within it, each according to the kind and quality of its field. Where each individual would wind up within the main field then would be a matter of inexorable law and absolutely unavoidable, as is illustrated by the millions of people who perform the same tasks over and over with absolutely the same results, almost as if following ritual. Perhaps they are always sick, always defeated, just barely misers, perhaps always broke, always out of a job. If we give just the slightest reflection to our own lives, we cannot help but be startled by how we seem dogged by the same situation in all things, year after year, time after time. The deadly recurrence is the source of most frustration, and mental illness is the bottom root of all failure. Yet it is avoidable, and the way by which it is avoidable brings complete emancipation of the mind and spirit. For the tiny electromagnetic field has inherent within it the ability to change the kind and quality of its field, so that it will be moved about within the main field with all the power and sureness of the main field until it arrives at the position of its new quality of consciousness demands. The important thing to remember about this illustration is that the tiny electromagnetic field does not move itself. It is moved by the large field, and behind its movement lies all the power of the large field. Any attempt by it to move itself is obviously futile, since it is held in place by a power infinitely greater than itself. And it is held where it is because of what it is. The moment a change occurs within itself, it is moved by a power outside itself to a new position in the field, one in keeping with its new potential. The mental world. The foregoing is admittedly an analogy, but nevertheless, S.W. Tromp, in his remarkable book Psychical Physics, has proved beyond all doubt that the human being exudes certain electromagnetic fields, that the earth itself gives off an electromagnetic field, and his illustrations are so impeccably documented that there cannot possibly be any scientific quarrel with them. We indeed may be on the very threshold of scientific proof of those invisible areas of human aspiration that have hitherto been the proven province of philosophers, diviners, and priests. Departments of investigation into the paranormal abilities of the human psyche have been established at our leading universities, and it is now surely only a matter of time until we are faced with the final, irrevocable proof of our intuitive perception, the power of mind over matter. It is a mental world we live in, not a physical one at all. The physical is merely an extension of the mental, and an imperfect extension at that. Everything we see, hear, and feel is not a hard and inescapable fact at all, but only the imperfect revelation to the senses of an idea in mind. Preoccupation with sensory experience has focused attention on effects instead of causes, has led scientific investigation down a blind alley where everything grows smaller into infinity or larger into infinity, and walls man off from the secrets that lie behind life. It is not the planets and stars, the elements and winds, or even the existence of life itself that is the miracle that demands our attention. It is consciousness. It is the mere fact of being, the ability to say I. Consciousness is an indisputable fact, the greatest miracle of all, and all the sights and sounds of the world are merely side effects. The hidden I. To be conscious is to be conscious. There are not different kinds. The I that is in your neighbor is the exact same I within you. It may appear to be different through being attached to a different sensory experience, but that is only because it has allowed itself to be conditioned by such experience. In point of actual fact, consciousness is never the result of experience, but the cause instead of whatever we find it. It is primary aware of existing, of being I. There is only one basic consciousness in all creation. It takes up its residence in all things, appears to be different according to the things it enters into, but in essence is never changed at all. It is intelligence, awareness, energy, power, creativeness, the stuff from which all things are made. It is the Alpha and Omega of existence. First cause, it is you. Everything in nature contains all the powers of nature. Everything is made of one hidden stuff, wrote Ralph Waldo Emerson. He pierced the veil, perceived behind the sense-enamoring dance of nature's myriad forms, the workings of the one mind and one intelligence from which all life and aspiration spring. There can be no inner peace or surety of action without this basic spiritual knowledge. The man who lives isolated from the roots of his being has cut himself off from the source of all power and dwells alone and without resource in a hostile and threatening world. Let him once perceive the true nature of life and his relationship to it, and he soon sees that the world always reflects his thoughts. The mask. The surface mind or sense self or ego is the villain of the play that is being enacted on the human stage at present. Man as a form of life is sufficiently evolved so as to understand his separateness and uniqueness. He looks in the mirror and understands the reflected animal he is. He is concerned with the appearance and welfare of this animal and ponders its relationships with the world and others. He does not truly understand what he is, only that he is conscious and confined within a particular body, and the experience and knowledge he acquires, together with his disposition as to their use, he labels I, and thus he is deluded into calling a ghost by his own name. Hidden behind this ghost, obscured by its struggles and fancies, is the secret self, which even though hidden, ignored, or misunderstood, nevertheless moves all things on the chessboard of life according to their natures and aspirations. We are never ego or sense self. These are masks we don as we play at the parts we find in life. What we truly are is not a changing thing, but is whole and entire, powerful and serene, limitless and eternal. It springs from the inexhaustible source of life itself, and when we learn to identify ourselves with it, then we have hitched a ride on a power so far beyond our tiny temporal selves that our lives are changed in the most amazing manner. The imprisoned self. To be what we are and to become what we are capable of being, wrote Robert Louis Stevenson, is the only end of life. But when we stultify our divine birthright in manacles of mental and spiritual limitations, then we have no alternative but stagnation and pain. As long as we are responsible solely to the stimuli that impinge upon our senses from the outside world, we have no choice but to be victims of every circumstance. Locked to the senses, we reel under each stimulus, now aggressive, now afraid, now joyful, now sad, now seeking death, now life. But always our inner serenity and equilibrium are in the hands of something we neither understand nor control. And so we are puppets pulled by invisible and unknown strings, swirling in the maelstrom of life like scraps of paper in the wind. And if perchance we garner knowledge enough to perceive our helplessness, then we often are overcome with such depths of sadness as to make effort against our bonds an almost unimaginable thing. But the moment that we pause long enough in the headlong rush of life to see that we are not moving in accord with or in response to our own decision, but rather in reaction to the world around us, then we have taken the first step toward freedom. Only one who knows his slavery can aspire to be free, just as true freedom is possible only to one who has experienced change. Our hates, loves, fears, envies, aspirations, deceits are for the most part products of circumstance, of false and limiting codes and mores, more often innate terrors of mountains that are molehills. And the solution to all of them is to stand foursquare before them, daring them to do their utmost, exposing them for what they are, thus forswearing allegiance to the cupidity of the deluding and blinding ego, which forever keeps us thinking we are greater than others and less than we truly are. The liberating power. It is not necessary to become a mystic, even a philosopher, certainly not a melancholy metaphysician, in order to come to grips with the spiritual side of existence. To establish a mental causation in your life that will give you control of circumstance. What is necessary, however, is that you do not immediately throw out the door everything that has to do with spirit simply because it is the established province of religion. You may be a Christian, or a Hindu, or a Muslim, or a Buddhist, a Taoist, or a Shintoist, but that only increases your individual human responsibility to think through all issues that bear on the world and life and death and your individual being. Only when you come to grips with your own mental essence, only when you arrive at a realization of the ephemeral, ever-changing nature of I, will it become apparent that everything is in a constant state of growth and development and aspiration, and there are no limits and finalities and defeats, and anything is possible to one who first conceives the image in his mind. There is within us a power of complete liberation, descended there from whatever mind or intelligence lies behind creation. And through it we are capable of becoming anything and doing anything we can visualize. The mental stuff of which we are made is of such kind and quality that it responds to the formation of images within it by the creation of a counterpart, that is, discernible to the senses. Thus, any picture we hold in our minds is bound to resolve in the material world. We cannot help ourselves in this. As long as we live and think, we will hold images in our minds, and these images develop into the things of our lives. And so long as we think a certain way, we must live a certain way, and no amount of willing or wishing will change it. Only the vision we carry within. The law of life. It is astounding and sad to see the many thousands of people whose mental machinery keeps delivering to them the very effects they say they do not want. They bewail the fact that they are poor, but that doesn't make them richer. They complain about their aches and pains, but they keep right on being sick. They say that nobody likes them, which means they don't like anybody. They aren't bold, they aren't aggressive, they aren't imaginative. Mentally they quiver and quake and are bound to negative delusions. It simply doesn't matter what the pictures in your mind is, it is delivered nonetheless, with the same amount of faithfulness and promptness, if it is a picture of poverty or disease or failure, as it would be if there was a picture of wealth or health or courage or success. The law of life is this: all things, both good and evil, are constructed from an image held in mind. A tightrope walker edges swiftly out on his elastic and minuscule support, high in the air, wavering, suspended on a thin black line. He seems to transgress all normal laws of behavior. What is astonishing is not that he is able to do this thing so well, but he dares attempt it at all. Yet what he is doing is an inescapable result of mental law. Long before he set his first uncertain steps on the taut wire, he made a picture in his mind. Throughout his early bumbling attempts, the picture persisted. He saw himself agile, balanced, adroitly crossing the swaying wire, and this vision sustained him through all early failures. Now he flaunts his skill and courage in the very face of death, nonchalantly as the spectators gasp. He is sure, poised, confident, delivered of all fear and mishap by the sustaining picture within. Image power. The image power of the mind is imagination. But just what imagination is and where it comes from, nobody seems to know. A famous surgeon is reputed to have remarked that he had sliced open many a brain without ever having seen a picture or found a thought. The imagination certainly is no more exclusive property of the brain than of an arm, a leg, or the stomach. Thinking is performed not by a part of the body, or even the whole body, but by the inhabitant within. It is that function which enables consciousness to know its surroundings and to know itself. Only one who thinks it is able to say I, only one who can say I, is able to cast up pictures within his own being known to no others. The eternal striving knowledge and capacity, the most apparent thing about life, is resolved always by two principal elements of the strife, the knower and the thing to be known. By definition, these appear to be separate, and we observe that a man ordinarily copes with the outer world by tabulating the manner in which it impinges upon his senses. A thing is so long and so wide, and weighs so much, and is so hard and a certain color, a name is given it, and as long as each subsequent time it is encountered, it maintains the majority of its original characteristics. A man recognizes it for what it is, and knows it when he sees it. If you ask him if it is near, he is able to answer instantly, simply by glancing around. If its presence produces some particular effect upon him, like fear or anger or love or tension, then the mere presence or absence of this object may be said to materially affect his life. In that case, his state of mind is not a matter of his own determination, but instead is the direct result of the object as he encounters it or avoids it in the outer world. Inner vision. Life in animal and vegetable forms is purely a matter of reaction. There is first the organism, then there are the elements that intrude their presence upon it. The conflict thus engendered resolves itself in the process of evolution as each organism attempts to overcome the obstacles it meets. But this influence through the lower stages of evolution apparently comes only from outside, and it is the result of processes and forces beyond the control of the organism. Nature holds the world and life in an iron grip, and lower animal as well as vegetable life is led inexorably along a path it neither understands nor can avoid. A thing is the kind of thing it is through a creative process that appears to be outside it. Existence itself in any shape or form appears to be beyond the power and scope of the individual being. We are born and we die. Nothing within our known powers or knowledge can aid or stop these events. And insofar as we live in response to the senses, we are automatons only, and the shape of our lives is predestined by the circumstances we encounter. The secret self. It is knowledge about faith in this secret self that is the key to correct use of the imagination. No man lives in the dark when he learns where the light is. To understand the secret self is to free oneself from bondage to circumstance, to lose within a power compounded upon itself, to provide life with perfect working and perfect serenity. This entity within each of us, not the ego, not experience, not time or circumstance or place or position, but consciousness, only the I, divested of all accoutrements except pure sense of existence. This is the self that contains all power, whose essence is greater than the individual, greater than 10,000 individuals. For it is supporting structure upon which all things are built, the evolving self of the universe. It is not confined to the body, to a time or place or condition, but is in all times and places and conditions. It is infinite and eternal and only one, but being so easily manifest as the finite and temporal and many, all are contained within, yet each contains it all. For by its very nature, all of it is every place at the same moment. The secret self is timeless and eternal. It is the self of the universe, and it is the self of each of us, the self of you. It was never born, and it will never die. It enters into each of its creations and becomes that creation. What is going on in life and the world and the universe is completely its working and the result of its secret purpose and undivulged goal. The nature of its being is mental. Its essence is dynamic and creative. It is the eternal stuff that occupies all space and time, and within which there is no dimension. It is all ends and middles and opposites and extremes, and it is infinitely creative. The myriad forms of life are but a tiny indication of its vast potential for plastic multiplicity out of its essential oneness. Mental ascendancy. The secret self is within you. It is not visited upon a fortunate few and withheld from others, but it is totally existent in the heart of each of us, insofar as we are able to divorce ourselves from the world and the ego and sense stimuli. We will become increasingly aware of its existence within and consciously strive to identify ourselves with it. It is through this identification that the seeds of power are sown. Only one who is able to cast off the limitations of ego and improve the quality of his consciousness through disciplinary use of the imagination is able, by means of direct identification, to become one with the secret self and thus attain to a measure of its power for perfection. The potential for achieving this astounding goal lies within each of us. By means of inner mental ascendancy and pictorial definition, a man may become one with the purposes of the secret self and thus become infallible in his works and his goals. This is a pretty big capsule to swallow. Our materialistic society, with its reverence for the products of science, has exercised 3/4 of our mentality. We have concerned ourselves too much with the world, what it is, what is in it, and how we use it, and today we know little more of the origins and purposes of life than we did before men were able to read and write. It is difficult when we know something of the principles of the gasoline engine, the generation and transmission of electricity, the refining and tempering of steel, of electronic and radio transmission, to admit the possibility that something radically opposed to the viewpoint of science could have a foundation in fact. Science says the laws of nature are supreme, and man must learn to live with them in order to prosper. Now comes this diametrically opposed theory. Nature is subservient to mind, not the mind of man as we know it, but the supreme mind or secret self that lies behind life. And this secret self is within each of us. We can come to know it and to use it and thus transcend the laws of nature and free ourselves from bondage to the senses and the material world. Thoughts become things. What is going on in life is the evolution of the individual to complete oneness with the secret self. The universal being that lies behind creation has differentiated into finite form, taken guise, so to speak, in order to work out the manifold sides of its infinite and eternal nature. Therefore, the man who expands his consciousness is fulfilling the fondest wish of life. It is not necessary that we become saints to understand as much of the secret self as is necessary to use its power in our affairs. To know this law is enough. Whatever we accept as a permanent mental image in our consciousness must manifest in our world, for we become in life what we are in consciousness, and nothing can alter that fact. It takes a great deal of courage to admit to yourself that if you are sick, frightened, frustrated, or defeated, you have brought these conditions on yourself, and no one but yourself can get rid of them. Occasionally, someone so afflicted will experiment with the power of his mind to cure him, but will give it only the most cursory trial. If, for example, he is ill and in pain, he might say, "I visualize myself well and happy, but I hurt just as much as ever." What he didn't do above all things was visualize himself well and happy. He visualized himself sick and in pain. The moment he began to visualize himself well and happy, he would become well and happy. This is not a law that works once in a while or part of the time or on auspicious occasions. It works all of the time, and it works in the exact same way. And it is returning to you right now in the material world, the images you maintain in your mind. You cannot escape them. They surround you, sustain you, or torment you. They are good or evil, or uplifting, or degrading, or exalting, or painful, according to the vision that prompts them. And as long as you are alive, as long as you think and imagine, you are literally surrounded, day and night, by the images that predominate in your consciousness. Thought control. The startling power of the secret self is that it always makes manifest the image it beholds. Nothing illustrates this fact better than the current experiments with hypnosis. A man may be in such excruciating pain that even narcotics will relieve him, but he can be put under deep hypnosis and told there is no pain at all, and presto, there is no pain. He may have a deep and abiding fear of crowds, but under hypnosis it can be suggested to him that he likes crowds, and lo and behold, he enjoys them most of all. He can become stronger, healed of disease, smarter, more aggressive, possessed of endurance and indomitableness, all because these things are impressed upon his psyche as facts, and the image in his mind grows from them. Aha, the cry goes up, find me a good hypnotist. I want to be smart and strong and successful in all those good things, and to be rid of weakness and pain and failure. And hypnosis can do it too, if you are willing to abdicate as the person in charge of your life. If you are willing that someone else run it every hour of every day throughout the whole of it, then you can turn your life over to a hypnotist and he can remake it in the image you outline. However, it will make a small difference to you. You may still be in the vehicle, but you no longer will be driving. If effort and strife and the overcoming of obstacles are the spurs to growth that the secret self intends them to be, then surely you will have abdicated from life itself. You need no hypnotist to put the power of the secret self to constructive work in your life. No hypnotist can overcome the negative image making of your mind unless he is with you 24 hours a day. You are the only one in constant rapport with yourself, and thus you are the only one able to police the thoughts and images you entertain. If you let the image be prompted by something outside you, then you exercise no control over your life. If you accept images only in accord with your desires, then life will deliver your inner goals. In any case, the magnificent promise of the secret self is this: you can change your life by altering the images in your mind, for what comes to you in the end is only that which you have been accepting in consciousness. Now, there are many people who agree with this premise, but are quick to point out that the images in the consciousness of most people are projected there from the subconscious and are not of their own choosing. Most schools of psychotherapy apparently feel this way, for they propose a tedious and time-consuming treatment bent on expurgating from the subconscious memories of painful and bitter occasions, which might prompt unpleasant images in the mind. 7 or 8 years of this process have not noticeably emptied painful memories from the subconscious of most patients, and in any case, if a treatment is truly efficacious, it cannot possibly consume so long a time. The saddest thing about the modern put the blame elsewhere school of psychoanalysis is that the person undergoing it accepts it as justification for his failure to police his consciousness, and thereafter expects such policing to be accomplished by having the neighborhood rid of criminals. If he achieves some semblance of a changed consciousness in the hands of the psychiatrist, he soon goes back to a world full of negative thoughts and ideas, and just because he does not police his own mind, they readily find acceptance there. You may not be able to alter the positions of the stars, to stop the earth from revolving, to cause the winds to blow or the sea to calm, but you can choose what you will think. You can think what you want to think. You can think only in response to an inner vision and a secret goal. And if you take your stand with a firm heart and a high resolve, you will be successful. And you will not be intimidated. And you will project your image clear and true, and its counterpart will return to you in the world. Dry Hole Casey. In a little village on the western slopes of the Great Divide lived a man whose entire life had followed one ignominious pattern. For 35 years he had been an oil well driller and had followed the frontiers of oil exploration throughout the United States. During that time he had drilled 44 wildcat wells, and not one of them had made a strike. He drilled in Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Louisiana, California, New Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, Wyoming, and still he had not hit. Oil operators wouldn't hire him anymore. He became known as Dry Hole Casey, a nice guy but strictly out of luck. Finally, he took a job in a Colorado mine and eked out his days without hope. He kept his drilling rig, though. It was his first love. Weekends would find him in the backyard, lubricating and cleaning its parts, handling them with ritualistic care. One day in late spring, when the snow stood in broad, glittering fields on the slopes of the mountains, and the rivers and streams were high and roily, he wandered up into the woods and sat gazing over the valley. The valley was basin hemmed in on 3 sides by a precipitous intrusions of granite, and these mountains had been productive of many minerals: lead, zinc, silver, tungsten, manganese. Our friend gazed to the west to where the basin sloped down to a plateau. Suddenly his mind formed the perfect picture of a faulted anticline, a predominant type of subsurface oil trap. The image seemed superimposed over the scene before his eyes, so that he could almost see the oil below the surface of the ground. He trembled before his vision, could not resist it. It seemed like a perfect visitation from heaven, and he left the mountainside absolutely certain that within the small valley lay a major oil field. Next day he quit his job in the mine, and with his savings managed to procure oil lease options on the land he visualized as being the most favorable. Now he had to raise capital to complete his leasing arrangements and provide funds to drill an initial well, a gargantuan task, since everyone knew also his history of failure. But the vision in his mind persisted. It led him to take a bus to an eastern city in quest of funds. It led him, after a week of discouragement, to a park bench and a seat alongside an elderly man who quietly and patiently fed the squirrels. It was a bright, warm day, and the squirrels were active, playing and clowning over the proffered food. And the two men laughed at their antics, and each told stories of other squirrels and other times, and agreed that the foibles of humanity were not shared by animals. Warmed at each other's company, they agreed to lunch together at a nearby restaurant. In the course of the luncheon, the oil driller told his new friend of his vision and the problem. His friend was interested, questioned him closely about the vision he had on the mountainside, seemed impressed that it persisted. "How much money do you need?" he asked. $50,000, replied the oil well driller. "I will provide it," the man said. Suddenly, "We will be equal partners." It seemed incredible, but there it was, a chance acquaintanceship on a park bench, and the money was provided. It is almost anticlimactic to relate that the subsequent well discovered a rich oil field. There simply was no alternative, and the man who put up the money knew that it would. He had a sufficient experience with the power of inner vision to manifest in the world, to be absolutely sure of his position. He did not dwell for a moment on his partner's previous failures, only on the vision that possessed him now. Dissolving the mask of vanity. What a strange alchemy prompted our oil driller to have this clear vision in his mind, a vision that subsequently made him a rich man when his whole previous life had been unbroken line of failure. Surely the wells he had drilled before had been drilled in response to a vision too. Why should they have failed? They failed because the vision he possessed then was one of failure. Sure, he would have denied it, but it was true. Perhaps a sense of the great hazard connected with searching for oil lay at the crux of his subconscious. Perhaps he felt that the odds were against him. Perhaps he was conscious of the fact that there are millions of acres of land without oil under them. In any case, his vision was one of failure. From whatever case, and he was led into those arrangements that would inevitably cause him to put his drill bit down in barren soil. And in two cases where he actually had drilled on productive land, he once had ceased making hole only 27 feet above the productive formation, and another time failed to make a test of a sand that later produced several million barrels. But he could not help himself. He was only following the dictates of the vision in his mind. See how different his behavior was in discovery of the basin field. He saw the oil. He knew it was there. There was not the slightest doubt in his mind, and that is the way he acted. There was no resisting him this time, his vision for production, and that is what resulted. Why? Why did he finally have a positive vision after harboring a negative one for so many years? Such a question could not be answered with certainty without making an intensive study of the man. But in all probability, the debilitating and crippling factor was fear. Fear, more than any other single thing, warps and distorts our vision. Our oil driller most likely was afraid of failure, and his apprehension twisted his inner vision from success to defeat. He couldn't win as long as the fear stayed with him. Finally, when he had reached the absolute bottom, when the business he loved had rejected him and the men in it no longer would hire him, fear simply left him. Everything bad had happened already. What more was there to fear? And in this psychologically relieved attitude, the secret self was able to get through the mask of vanity, and the ensuing vision inevitably brought success. Mind over matter. It is computed, wrote Jonathan Swift, that 11,000 persons have at several times suffered death rather than submit to break their eggs at the smaller end. The resistance of the human mind to change is amazing, especially when it appears so obvious that life itself is nothing more than change. Multitudes of people, many of them very intelligent, argue that all cause is in the physical world and that mentality only observes. They seem determined to go down to their deaths with this frightfully erroneous viewpoint, even though their own inner attitudes belie their stand, even though their slogans extol the power of the mind over matter. On locker room doors and conference room walls, the framed and placarded slogans emblazed their messages. A quitter never wins. A winner never quits. A team that won't be beat can't be beat. Put your heart in it. All else will follow. Make up your mind, and you make up the future. But these verbal expositions to thoughtful vision are regarded as having precedence only in such matters as team effort, to bind together the group for a purpose, and their tremendous importance to individual creativeness is largely overlooked. From the inner vision, all things are done. The bridge is built, the tower constructed, the oil well drilled, the motion picture made, the book written, the picture painted, music composed, and outer space probed, secrets of the atom exposed. There is absolutely no such thing as accomplishment unless it is preceded by a vision of that accomplishment. You simply can't reach across the table and pick up a dish unless you first have the mental image. All things come to all people according to the pictures that form in their minds. And the effort that is extended in this world escapes fates that are inevitable, insufficient to construct a tower to the sun. No amount of movement of physical energy is expended can prevail against a wrong mental image. Similarly, the possessor of the correct mental image is guided to perform the work to be done, effortlessly, almost nonchalantly. Most of the struggling and striving in the world is done by people who are trapped into unwanted circumstances through incorrect mental visualization. And the fact that they visualize the very thing that they profess to abhor is the contradictory situation that is filling our psychiatrists' couches. Mastery over fate. Bernard Spinoza wrote, "So long as a man imagines that he cannot do this or that, so long as he determined not to do it, and consequently so long is it impossible to find him that he should do it. The picture that forms in the mind, whether for good or ill, will deliver its inevitable consequence. The problem is not with the mental or spiritual fact of physical fulfillment of mental visualization, but rather of finding a key that will enable each person to cast up mental images at will, hold them until realization, and not have other images intruded by recalcitrant subconscious, which so often runs contrary to the wishes of the conscious mind. In the deeper reaches of the human psyche, the seeds are formed that motivate a whole life, and a man either accedes to or takes command of these invisible prompters. If he accedes, his life will be run from a source beyond his conscious control. If he takes command, he becomes master of his fate. Taking command is never as simple as it sounds. It requires a firmness and boldness that only few people innately possess. Most of us live as complete slaves to reaction, absolute victims of the commands of the subconscious, and we seldom, if ever, even think it's possible that we can overcome our feelings and react in an entirely different way than circumstances would have us do. For example, if you participate in a test and defeat seems inevitable, you only make it certain by acceding. But if you keep alive your spirit by a vision of victory, by an absolute resistance to the importunities of defeat and disaster, who knows what miracles may occur? The mental vision that resists all sensual stimuli becomes at length a thing unto itself, and its resolution as objective fact in the material world cries out for utterance and will not be stifled. Nature's vast creativity springs from the infinite potential of the secret self. Anything possible of conception is sure to eventually be created as a solid material fact for all the world to witness. There is no such thing as an idea without visible resolution, for the great plasticity of the secret self shapes every idea contained within it, and whoever is possessed of a thought is possessed of a thing as well, as long as he holds his image clear. Creativity. Creativeness is not a part of the surface self, of the ego, the conscious mind, the physical or sensual being. It emanates upward through the levels of consciousness from the secret self, takes shape and form through a power greatly beyond and infinitely more powerful than the small individual I. That part of a man which is most powerful of all is invisible, seems apart from him completely, is hidden in the deepest recesses of his being, is not callable by name, is not recognizable through the physical senses, cannot be coerced, but responds innately and completely to image. This is the great plastic secret self from which all things are made, the creative self of the universe, maintaining a sameness in all differentiations, being eternally one in the midst of multiplicity. This is the secret self within you, which is not different from you, which in final analysis is altogether you. You are not conscious mind or ego or memory or sensual being, but were born directly from the mind that formulated and constructed the universe. And you are not different from that mind, but attached to it by a mental and spiritual construction that makes you and it the same. Abandonment of the surface self and seeking self-balance in the deeper regions of consciousness is the pathway to power and perfection in works. For when a man attunes himself to the life force and mental entity that gives him consciousness and lives within him, then he takes on, by a process of identification, the effectiveness and potency of the infinite and eternal entity from which his individual life has sprung. His horizons expand, his consciousness widens. There wells up from secret and subterranean springs a constantly increasing and never ceasing power for perfection and for perfect understanding. His faith is replaced with simplicity and unfailing trust in the inherent power of the secret self to return in material fact those mental images that live within him. And he need not have the key that unlocks the universe in order to use effectively this basic law. It bothers him not that there exist doors in the mental and spiritual realm that thus far have not yielded. He need not know all and understand all to use those truths he thus far has discovered. And he lives in the consciousness that life is a mental adventure and not a physical journey. Knowledge, the great lever. We all have seen people achieve great ends effortlessly. We have seen others strive frantically toward some goal only to consistently fall short. We are assured on all sides that hard work makes the successful man. Yet we discern almost immediately that hard work sometimes fails of accomplishment, while fortune often smiles on the man who seems to make little effort at all. Shakespeare wrote, "There is a tide in the affairs of men, which taken at the flood leads on to fortune." The story is told of the man whose furnace refused to work and who subsequently called a repairman. The repairman struck the furnace a blow with his hammer, and it promptly resumed working. He presented a bill for $100. Outrageous, sputtered the irate householder. I want that bill itemized. All right, answered the repairman. He scribbled on the bill, striking one blow with hammer, $1, knowing where to strike, $99. It is not how hard we work that matters, but what we get done. It is not the wailing and gnashing of teeth that is the show, but the things that are built and accomplished. The knowledge of the simple lever 6,000 years ago might have saved 1 million hours of backbreaking labor. And had television existed in the time of Christ, a different shape indeed might have been given the Christian church. Knowing where and when to strike, just as the repairman so aptly illustrated, is the goal to be sought, and not the energy to run 1 million circles around a field which does not need to be circled even once. Knowledge is the thing, not physical effort. All things exist because of mental causes, which have risen in the physical world in response to ideas held in mind. Mind is first cause, and he who is guided by this knowledge discovers the fountain of power. Your secret self is a giant self, dwarfing into nothingness, your surface mind and ego. It is a self without limits in space and time, and anything possible to it. Its manifestations on the human scene sometimes seem supernatural. It outcrops in our geniuses, in those with second sight, in our artists, our explorers, our pioneers, our adventurers. Its presence may be intimately felt in the fields of parapsychology, extrasensory perception, precognition, clairvoyance, thought transference. It stands behind all human endeavor and aspiration as the guiding intelligence of evolution. Life is going somewhere high and lofty and worthwhile, and the path by which the heights are to be scaled is safe and secure and well known. Only in partial knowledge is there confusion, and only through separate and incomplete view of the surface self are we rendered impotent and afraid in a world that should be ours. The little mind that sits immediately behind our eyes was not the horizons nor the expanded consciousness to see the larger picture, the worthier and greater goal of the secret self. All individual suffering, frustration, and failure stem from the failure of the surface mind to find and properly identify itself with the divine. In isolating ourselves from the true roots of our being, we are thrown out of the kilter with the power and surety of the Supreme. By fancying ourselves to be sense-minded, we are like the severed tail of a snake, possessed of movement still, but senseless now, without purpose or entity, helter-skelter, scratching out a crazy pattern in the dust. The giant within. We are one body only, one mind only, one deep and abiding intelligence. We are not tiny infinitesimal parts of an infinite and incomprehensible whole, but we are the very whole, that entire mind, that great and vast intelligence from which the universe has evolved. And everything contained within the universe is contained within us. And if we truly understand ourselves, we understand the world and everything in it. You can be anything you want to be. Do anything you want to do. Tread any path you will tread. Become master of your fate. Ordain your future. But you will not do these things by railing against the circumstance, by throwing yourself frantically against events and persons simply because they do not seem to be in accord with your plans. Only by perceiving the hidden purpose behind events, the true motivations that actuate people, will you be able to attune yourself to life, to act in accord with the gigantic tides that bring the future. The faculty is yours once you have gleaned the existence of the secret self and have set about striving to live in accord with it rather than with the surface self that has moved you heretofore. We all aspire to goals, desire, or to improve our understanding and our abilities. We would not be alive if growth were not inherent in us. But oftentimes our growth becomes calcified through being ringed around with impermeable layers of selfishness and conceit. The selfishness is not necessarily just acquisitiveness. It may even be exemplified by an overwhelming generosity. It is simply primary concern for the ego, a living by and in accordance with the little I that constitutes the average person's knowledge of himself. Such conceit makes knowledge of self a constant judgment, a comparison with others. Favorably or unfavorable, it feeds on flattery and victory, is decimated by criticism, defeat. It has no true existence, but depends entirely upon circumstance and the reactions those circumstances set up within it. As a consequence, it is always exultant or sad, for its impression of itself is that it is either better than or worse than everything that confronts it. It has absolutely no knowledge of equality, the ultimate resource. The breaking through the limiting boundaries of the ego into the unimpaired vision and knowledge and joy of the secret self is the undoubted goal of evolution, the purpose of life. This transformation, truly a transfiguration of the mind and spirit, is not an absolute thing, but a matter of degree. Is partially achieved at this moment by thousands of living persons, is possible of limited attainment by anyone who lives. To exist immersed in the ego is to live a restricted life, to realize only a small fraction of your potentiality. Such a deliberate subordination to the dictates of nature is a subjection to pain and suffering and death and decay. Such subjection is normal to lower forms of life, seems part of the plan by which the secret self is emerging from matter. But when consciousness has reached the point where it recognizes its imprisonment, when it sees its subjection to circumstance and pleasure and pain, then it must strive to be free, to establish a truer order for its development. It then must break through the barriers of its awareness, cease living in the ego, and attain the widened horizons and powers of the secret self, or it will fall back into the inertia of the sensual nature, lose its capacity for growth and development, and so cease to represent the secret self at all. To the person trapped and resigned to be trapped in the ego, there is no final end, but suffering and pain. Only in the divine lie, the ultimate resources that overcome all obstacles, and only in seeking to discover the secret self has a man firmly set foot on the one and only path that leads to success, serenity, and joy, struggle and sacrifice. Nothing, of course, can be accomplished without a fight. Life itself is a struggle, and each of us enters it daily. It is simply a question of where to expend the effort, pursuing the material wraiths of the physical world that constantly seem to elude us, or concentrate on an inner resource that controls the outer world. It is a wise man who expends his energies developing his consciousness. He shortly will find that all aspects of the world have assumed an order and a benignity he would not have thought possible. All things appear to do his bidding, not because he truly bids them, but because he understands them. It is this knowledge attained by inner perception of the potentiality of each thing and circumstance that leads to beneficent power, that allows a man to move through the most intense conflicts with serenity and surety. He sees the thing to be done because he knows the outcome that must be achieved. And because of this inherent perception of the laws of life and nature, he appears to be modeling each event, shaping each thing. Yet it is not he who does this, but the secret self within him, to which he has entrusted himself completely and which guides his steps and actions with omnipotent assurance. Will you have the power and assurance and serenity of the secret self? Then there is something you must give up. You must give up the ego, that thing within you that you always have thought to be your very self. You must seek to shed that sense of separateness that is a product of your surface mind, and to search deep within your consciousness for the pure core of being that is the self of all things. It will not be easy. The sensual nature, with its constantly distracting stimuli, brings daily clarion calls from the outer world. But if your life has provided you full measure of pain and frustration from chasing these tempers and deceivers, then you will face them with resistance and resolve to pursue them no more. The path to power lies within you. All things will be found there. The fight is not between the world and you, but between your ego and your true self. Simply choose to find your true self, and in the end, you cannot lose. When the fight begins within himself, a man's worth something. Robert Browning. And that concludes the first chapter of Magic in Your Mind, a wonderful chapter in and of itself and by itself. The discussion here reflects what I talked about in the introduction, the idea that there is a universal mind and there is the secret self. In many ways, this discussion is spot on, 100% consistent with the law of one and with Neville Goddard. Neville Goddard always is talking about the power of the imagination, and he's clearly elucidating the law that your images that you see in your mind persistently is what you will see in the 3D world. We've got that part, and that's pretty easy to understand. The differentiation, or perhaps the further explanation, is when we say the law of one and everything is one thought, also everything is one mind. And there is a universal mind that goes beyond our own bodies, that has all the thoughts, that is a part of the imagination, that is the one. This wonderful thing, if understood and the lessons from this grasped, becomes the way to understand how to use this power. And that is what's so amazing about it. As you can tell, U.S. Andersen is a very good writer. It's a little bit different than some of the others, but it's all about that oneness and the separation that he's talking about, of you being separate from anyone else, is the core of this and is the hidden cause. The idea of the universal mind is the hidden cause that we talked about at the very beginning of all things. So there's a lot of really good tidbits in here, and I would love to get your idea. I love the idea of the electromagnetic mind, and that there's kind of a way of looking at the whole universe electrically, as if the mind portion of it is some electric thing, and then we are some tinier electric thing within the electricity that can affect the whole field around us where we're at. I love that. That's a cool explanation of how it works. And the hidden I, the mask, the imprisoned self, the liberating power of letting go of that and letting go of the ego is well discussed here in the law of life. And the image power and inner vision is the secret self, your higher self. The way he describes it, I believe he is talking about that. So check out my higher self meditation when you get a chance. And the discussion of the higher self in the law of one is a much more complicated explanation of what this means and I recommend that you check that out as well. I have an episode on the higher self in the Law of One, which you may also find interesting. All episodes of The Reality Revolution can be found at therealityrevolution.com. And welcome to the Reality Revolution.